Okay, let's get started. Welcome. Very glad today to have Dr. Bette Otto Bliesner here from CGD. And Bette received her PhD in metrology from the University of Wisconsin Madison, and held teaching positions at University of Wisconsin and then University of Texas. And she came to NCAR in 1995 and is a senior scientist in the paleoclimate group in CGD. And her research interests are to investigate past climate change and climate variability across a wide range of timescales under Earth's climate, or using Earth's climate system models. She's particularly interested in climate change forced naturally over glacier and interglacier cycles of the last few million years. She has been involved in IPCC since the third assessment and was the lead author on paleoclimate chapters in AR4 and AR5. And she has also served as the chair of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program Past Global Changes and is the NCAR co-chair for the CESM Paleoclimate Working Group. She's a member of the Scientific Steering Committee for the Paleoclimate Modeling Intercomparison Project, or PMIP. And today she's going to discuss the CESM project on last millennium simulation.
Well, thank you, Hanley, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for all attending. Since I'm used to talking people in CGD, if I use an acronym or that you don't quite know, just raise your hand. Feel free to interrupt me during this talk. So I wanted to just start with this picture that was painted in 1565 by Peter Bruegel. It's called Hunters in the Snow. And it shows kind of this very frigid Northern European winter they had. In fact, it was just one of many years in the 16th century when the winters in Europe were particularly severe. It's a time period that we call the Little Ice Age that is from about 1400 to about maybe 1850. And in particular, I want to talk about a project we're doing with the Community Earth System Model, the CESM. That's a coupled climate model that includes atmosphere, ocean, sea ice, and land in CGD. And not sure I'll answer this question, but talk a little bit about the solar climate connection. So it's only fitting to start with this landmark paper by Jack Eddy. He used a variety of sources, including this device shown here in the early 17th century that projected the sun onto a screen, and from that could count sunspots. And he identified this 70-year period here called the Maunder minimum, when there were virtually no sunspots observed. And since the Maunder minimum and an earlier solar minimum period, the Sporer minimum, fell during the coldest parts of the Little Ice Age, it was suggested that there might be this connection between kind of long-term variability of the sun and long-term variability of the Earth's climate. So what I want to talk about today, just start out with just a few examples, in fact 3 examples interpreted from Proxy records suggesting this solar climate connection, or sometimes with some caveats. Then talk about some previous work we did, kind of the foundational work looking at the last millennium with the climate models here at NCAR. Spend most of the time talking about this project called the CES Last Millennium Project, which is a community project we're doing in CGD. And these simulations are still ongoing, so really all I can give you is kind of a preview of some of the results rather than a complete analysis, and then talk about where we're going forward in the future. So the first example I took from one of Mike Mann's papers. In fact, this appeared in the Cyclopedia of Global Environmental Change, and it shows a number of time series here going from 1000 to 2000 AD, and highlighted here in the middle is one from Central England. Central England has probably the longest instrumental records, going about 350 years back, and along with this and some historical documents and also some Proxy records, these are relative temperature changes. You can see that in this period from about 1400 to 1850, that central England was cooler on average than it was either before or after then. And so this was termed the Little Ice Age. And what you can see, though, looking at the variety of other records, which include some marine records, like in the subtropical North Atlantic, some records of ice cores in the tropical Andes, that both the nature and the timing of kind of this cooler temperatures varied between regions. And so, although it was suggested that solar variability might be connected to these long-term variations, the heterogeneity of these records suggests maybe there's something a little bit more, some regional responses that we need to consider. The second record was a record that was published a few years ago. These scientists went to a cave in China and they collected a stalagmite that was I don't know how long, not very long, 118 millimeters long. And it actually was a continuous record from about 190 AD to 2003 when they collected the record. And they measured in it variations in the stable water isotope ratios, which they call del 18O, which looking at present day water in the cave versus precipitation, they interpret as annual rainfall. And so they use this to plot kind of variations in rainfall and thus the Asian monsoon over this time period. And overlaying on here in the red is a measure of solar irradiance that was constructed using the cosmogenic isotopes beryllium-10, carbon-14. And what they say in the legend is that the Asian monsoon is broadly correlated or follows solar variations, but the correlation coefficient is about 0.3. So they also go on to admit that there are many other factors that must control the Asian monsoon. And then the third is a bit longer set of records. And for those of you not used to looking geologic papers, although for last millennium, time goes from left to right. In geology, no matter how much I argue with them, time goes from right to left. So this is 10,000 years ago going to present. And they collected or analyzed a number of proxy records in the Atlantic region. This is a number of them from around Antarctica over the last 10,000 years. And they use wavelet analysis to see if there's a spectral imprint of solar forcing in these records. So the bottom here is beryllium-10, which they use as a proxy for solar irradiance. And what they suggest in the beryllium-10, you probably can't see the numbers there from the back, is you have a lot of power at about 2,500 years and then at about 1,000 years. They also see this in a number of the records, particularly here of the ice core records here, Taylor Dome and birds. So they suggest that millennial scale variability in these records can be explained by millennial scale variability in the sun's activity. Of course, this is just correlation. We're seeing similar imprints, it's not causation. And so to separate out the responses, we really need to come up with some way to quantify and to really attribute. And a good way to do that is to use models, such as the ones we have at NCAR. And what's especially challenging about the last millennium, we have these relatively small and short-lived forcings that, in addition to just the internal variability of the climate system, the ocean and atmosphere interacting in a couple mode, are acting together on the system. So we have tropical explosive volcanic eruptions, we have changes in solar activity, we have land use changes that started in the last millennium and accelerated as we went to present. And we have, in addition to what we're putting in the atmosphere in terms of greenhouse gases, we have natural variations in these greenhouse gases. So at NCAR, we've been using the climate system model since its first version to start looking at the last millennium and exploring and separating out some of these responses. So the first modeling we did was with the climate system model CESM1, a very low resolution version of it. We included in these simulations a reconstruction from the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica of not only when the volcanoes occurred, but how big the volcanoes were. We include the effect of aerosols and greenhouse gases, though notice that those variations are fairly small until you get to the 20th century, late 19th century. And then we did 3 different simulations looking at solar variability, scaling what we know from beryllium and 10 and carbon-14 into different magnitudes of how big these variations were going, particularly from these minimum to present. So we had one case, the blue dotted here, where there's a 0.65% increase in total solar irradiance going from Maunder minimum to present. A medium case, the red line here, 0.25%, a fairly typical solar variability used in simulations at the time. It was based on Judith Lean's of the mid-1990s. And then the green, a shorter simulation where we use 0.1%, kind of the revised reconstruction and what has been used in a lot of the simulations today. And then in the bottom here are the Northern Hemisphere temperature anomalies for those simulations as compared in the gray to kind of a range of what the reconstructions from observations and proxies suggest. And what you can see here is that it's the smaller, the medium or the low scaling of the insolation anomalies that better match the proxy data rather than this very large scaling one. Just in terms of spatial resolution, on the top is the temperature anomalies for the medieval climate anomaly or medieval warm period, as some referred to it in the past, right about 1000 AD, as compared to a time period kind of in the middle of the Little Ice Age from 1400 to 1700, as simulated by CSM1 with this medium scaling here. And so what you can see in this is, and only areas that are not hatched were significant at 95%. You can see that the simulation has greater warming at high latitudes in both hemispheres, also greater warming over the land than the ocean. As compared to Mike Mann's reconstruction, you can see that at least the amplitude of the warming is very similar, but there are some differences. In particular, he shows much more warming over the ocean than CSM did, and he shows actually cooling during the medieval climate anomaly in the Eastern Pacific. Should note, though, that most of the data is over the continents, in particular North America and Europe. So there are only a few points over the ocean, and basically this reconstruction took what he knew about spatial and temporal relationships over the globe, where he had the data and he had instrumental data for the 20th century, and used those to define the same relationships for the pre-instrumental. So we don't really have lots of measurements here over the ocean. We then went on as part of IPCC and CMIP-5, the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, to rerun the last millennium simulations with a newer version of the model, version 4, the Community Climate System Model, CCSM4. And what was important or very satisfying about doing this is we actually ran the same version at the same resolution, so about a 1 degree atmosphere, 1 degree ocean, as all the future projections that CGD were doing for IPCC. So we weren't comparing apples and oranges. And what we see is the response is fairly similar to CSM 1.4 in terms of more warming at high latitude, more warming over the land than the ocean. But it's important to note that the TSI variations going from Maunder minimum to present in this new simulation were 0.1%. So we have a lot less solar forcing, but we're still getting about the same response. And compared to Mike Mann, we're neither better or worse than his reconstruction. So just kind of summarizing here from these, from the proxy records and these earlier simulations, the attribution to the data is weak. There may be some suggested mechanisms, but they're not really tested, if at all. And the models, we only have one realization, and that's true of most of the models. So what we decided to do at NCAR, and it's made possible by the computing power of Yellowstone. Those of you that don't run on the computers, that's what Yellowstone looks. They finally made the computer look interesting for slideshows compared to what we used to have. We decided to do a project we call the CES Last Millennium project. It uses the newest version of the model, CESM, so we use for the atmosphere model CAM 5 at about a 2 degree resolution. Version 4 of the land model, we use the ocean model at a 1 degree resolution, the sea ice. And we, with this configuration, on a good day, and Yellowstone has gotten more busy with time, but on a good day, we could actually finish a last millennium simulation going all the way to 2005 in about 2 months. That's lengthened as the computer's gotten more busy. And we designed 26 simulations here to sample both the different forcings, but also the internal variability. So we have a 1,000-year control that's just forced with 850 AD conditions to give us a measure of internal variability. We have a number of single forced simulations, orbital, land use, greenhouse, volcanic, with different numbers of ensemble members, and we have changed that over time. And then we have one simulation where we include all the forcings, and I'll show you the forcings we use in the next slide. We have 8 of those simulations. In addition, we hope to run a simulation where we scale up the solar variations. Gavin Schmidt's working on those at the moment. And we have 2 simulations planned for Wacom here. I'd actually hoped I'd have some of those to show, and we're getting close to starting those, but you'll have to stay tuned to see the Wacom simulations, hopefully in the next 6 months. So here are the forcings we use in the simulation. For the volcanic, we use the Gao et al. Reconstruction. It's based on the Antarctic and Greenland ice cores. And it uses kind of a prescribed, or it doesn't kind of, it uses a prescribed spatial and temporal distribution of the aerosols, so those are not predicted. For the solar variability, we use Vieira et al., which includes both total solar irradiance and spectral solar irradiance variations. It also has superimposed on it an estimated 11-year solar cycle. If you want to know more about how Gavin Schmidt did that, I can refer you to that paper. But the idea is we wanted to include that over the whole time series, and the reconstruction didn't have that. And the delta TSI from Maunder minimum present is 0.1%. An important thing to notice, and I'll comment on it more here, one of the later difficulties in doing attribution here is if we look at the medieval climate anomaly here, where's my pointer? You see there's not only do we have relatively high solar irradiance, but we have very few volcanoes. So they're both acting to want to warm the climate. Little ice age here, which is defined differently for many of the figures. I'm just going to show you 1400 to 1700, but other sources much longer. We have a lot of fairly good size eruptions when we have these lower variability or lower solar irradiance during the Maunder and Spore minimum. Also, I should note that if you look at the last millennium, you see a lot of large volcanoes compared to what we have in the 20th century, at least in this reconstruction. We also include the orbital variations, changes in the eccentricity, the obliquity, and precession, something that we didn't include in our CSM1 simulations. These are small changes, but they're seasonal changes, but they could be important in some regions. For example, Northern Hemisphere, June, July, August solar insolation decreases by a couple watts per meter squared as you go from 850 AD to present. We include greenhouse gases and land use changes. Again, these really become important starting at about 1800, 1850. So on the bottom here are the results from our first two ensemble members, where we include all the forcing. I've repeated on the top, CESM4 and CESM4 and CSM 1.4. What you can see is some similarities in terms of the magnitude of the warming, but also some differences. In the newer model, we don't get as much warming over Antarctica as we did in earlier versions of the model. And you can see between the two ensemble members also a difference. In particular, I just want to call your attention here, just one example. On ensemble member 1, we actually get fairly broad scale warming over Europe and Northern Asia, while ensemble member 2, very little warming. It's kind of important to remember when we're comparing to proxy data, nature only has one realization, which is why we need to run ensembles to really sample kind of the internal variability, even for fairly long time averages as this. This plot here, again, compares these two new simulations now for Northern Hemisphere temperature with time. All the colored lines on there are different proxy reconstructions, smooths with a 30-year Gaussian smooth. So you see that although they kind of agree broadly, there are some differences between them. The dark black line is the two CESM simulations, again, smooth, and what you can see is we have this kind of warmer period here in about 1100 AD, the medieval climate anomaly, cooling into the little ice age by about a half degree, and then warming into the 20th century. I should note that a couple things, the light lines here are the individual eruptions, so you can see the strong responses to some of the big eruptions, though it's only about 50 or 60% as much cooling as in this newer version with CAM5 than it was in simulations that we ran with CCSM4. And you see some differences. Just a good example is look right at the end here. We have a couple very big VEI5 volcanoes in the 50s and 60s. Mount Agung, I think it was in 1963. You see significantly cooling here in the second ensemble member, but very little cooling to those eruptions in the first ensemble member. So depending on kind of the climate state when they went off, it can make a difference. And some earlier work we did with CCSM3 also showed that the ocean state in the North Atlantic could have a huge influence on the magnitude and also the temporal length of the response to these volcanoes. One other thing I wanted to note here is we do have these time periods, for example, in the late 13th century, where you have a number of very large eruptions decadally spaced, so that you can kind of extend the volcanic cooling into the 14th century. And this is shown in this figure here from IPCC. We often think of volcanic events as very short-lived, that they can't give us these longer decadal to even centennial responses. What is shown here is on the top panel, volcanic forcing, and on the bottom, the responses, both in the models, the simulated that were contributed to IPCC for the last millennium red, with kind of the 90% spread, and also the data. So when we look at individual volcanic events, we see that indeed the response is fairly sharp, and then the models and even the data within 5 to 10 years have come back to climatology. But if you have a series of volcanoes, multi-decadal activity, then you can see, and this is true in both the data and the modeling, you see this kind of more extended response over a number of decades. In fact, the models, on average, come back to climatology faster than the data. One of the difficulties with trying to attribute to multi-decadal solar variability is the fact that we can never isolate it in nature from volcanic eruptions. So these were some of the solar minimums during the last millennium on the data and model, and you can see that superimposed the green line here is the volcanic activity. So then going on to the single forcing experiments, these are very important to try to understand the different attributions to these different forcings. And so this is for the first ensemble member, again, the surface temperature change from this medieval warm period to the little ice age. The top left is for the full forcing, so all the forcings, and then simulations that only include the volcanic, the solar, the orbital, the greenhouse gases, and the land use changes. And what you can see, quite interesting, and it actually makes sense, is we have a stronger response. At high latitudes, we get this polar amplification of the forcing, and really only the greenhouse gas only, and there are only small variations in the greenhouse gases, does not show kind of this warming in the Arctic. It's not always significant in all these simulations, but you can see for the solar only here that we get fairly substantial warming here extending from northern Canada across the Arctic to north of Asia. Some interesting things are one, kind of the orbital response. We actually get a response to sea ice along Antarctica due to the spring insulation and kind of the thermal inertia of the ocean. What kind of surprised me, but other European models have showed it, that land use, we get this warming. Land use from medieval climate anomaly to little ice age basically changes in Europe and Central and Southern Asia, and yet due to changes in the circulation, which we really need to analyze better, suggests that we can get warming at higher latitudes. Yes?
When you look at a comparison here, B and C, it looks like the single volcanic force and single solar force are almost equal amount of change. But the previous slide seems like you said that the solar one is much, much smaller.
Well, let me go to the next slide. Here's just on the top, the full forcing volcanic and solar for ensemble member 1, and the same for ensemble member 2. And what's really interesting there is, it gives us an idea of the robustness of the response and why one simulation is not enough, and why, with nature only having one realization, being careful comparing the two. So now you see in these two a much more muted solar response. We have number 3 and 4 of these, each of these in the computer right now, so it'll be interesting as we fill this out. Volcanic, you do see some differences, but much more robust in terms of the response. And I should comment here, because I'll come back to it later, is CESM is a low-top model. It has the top, so we're not including really much of the stratosphere. So this is only kind of the bottom-up, I'd call it, response. And I'll come back to that in a little bit here. You can also see in the full forcing experiments some differences here. One comment, these responses, as I showed you, versus Mike Mann aren't too bad. We're still trying to understand the hydrologic responses, and those are a lot harder to tease out from the proxy data and also seem to be too small in the model. So that's, stay tuned also. Sure.
What's the sign? Because I always thought, is this from the volcanoes? Is this with minus or that?
This is from medieval climate anomaly when there were few volcanoes and a little bit more solar irradiance versus little ice age when there was a lot of big volcanoes and lower solar irradiance, some of the minimum. So we're not actually doing, well, here we are, yeah. Here we are, we're doing in the volcanic only. You're looking at a period with basically no volcanoes versus one that has a lot. Does that make sense? So you have cooling when you have a lot.
That's what I thought, it's just red. So to
Yeah.
me, I was like, oh, volcanoes goes warming, but no, it's the opposite.
We're going no minus a lot, yeah, so it's opposite, yeah. That's an important point. And just one other slide on temperature. When you talk to the skeptics, they will say, well, 20th century warming is all solar. And so just what does the model say about that? These are the two Ensemble members for the simulations with just the greenhouse gases and just the solar, it should say 002. And this is the surface temperature change going from the little ice age to present. So now different time period. And you can see the solar does have a role, especially here at higher latitudes. You see some significant warming. I haven't changed the color scale here, and most of it's significant. But of course, greenhouse gases swap it. So what is happening when you go to the full forcing then is there are terms that want to cool going into the 20th century, like land use. So they damp out some of this greenhouse warming. And then just one other aspect of these simulations, one mechanism that has been proposed for kind of the regional responses that we see during the last millennium and how they respond to these forcings is that the modes of variability have a force component that give us kind of more power in the multi-decadal to centennial timescales. And so this is from the point of view, and lots of proxy reconstructions have been done suggesting, yes, that's true, not it's true. If you lay them all over each other, there's not really any correlation. So from the point of the view of the model, when we look at the major modes of variability, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, ENSO, North Atlantic Oscillation, we noticed a couple things. One is the patterns of these modes of variability are well simulated in CESM CAM5. The patterns really don't change whether you just run the control simulation that has only the internal variability, some of the single forcings, all of them. The patterns stay the same. And in terms of both ENSO and the North Atlantic Oscillation, the period, which is about 4 to 8 years in both of those, and the amplitude is the same among all the simulations, the control and the force simulations. So really, the model suggests there isn't a force component to this, which is kind of important when we're thinking about going into the future. The same is true of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, an oscillation that occurs in the North Pacific in terms of sea surface temperature. Again, the amplitude and the period is the same among these different runs, though it is important that Pacific Decadal Oscillation has more power in kind of decadal to centennial periods. And the reason you want to look at these in the model is our instrumental record is really quite short. as our historical simulation. So this can give you an indication both in the reconstruction and the models on kind of longer term. What we do find is this one mode called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or the AMO. The last millennium forcing does act as a pacemaker. For those of you that are not familiar with the AMO, it basically is a measure of variations in sea surface temperatures here in the North Atlantic, going from the equator to 60 north. This is from observations here. And if you do that index and then take out the mean, detrend it, what you see is this oscillation going from warmer North Atlantic to warmer to colder, then warmer, with a period of, quasi-period of about 60 to 70 years. But of course, the instrumental period is really quite short to be able to say a lot, since you can see we only really have two of these oscillations. Sometimes it's for that reason called the Atlantic multi-decadal variability. Is it truly an oscillation? It's important because it's been correlated to drought in the US, rainfall in the Sahel, and summer temperatures in North America and Europe. So in terms of our modeling simulations for the CESM, what I've plotted here on the top is the regression of the AMO on sea surface temperatures. The left here is the Hadley Center, lost my mouse, Hadley Center SSTs. The right is our control simulation, so it only includes internal variability. You can see quite close correspondence in the Atlantic region between observation and the model simulation. And this pattern looks the same in all our last millennium full-forced and single-forced simulations. Some of the connections to the other basins do look different. On the bottom is a power spectrum for ensemble member 1 on the left and the second ensemble member on the right. You can probably just barely see it. There's a light gray line here, which is the control simulation. We're looking at periods going out to 200 years here. And what you can see, the full forcing simulation in particular, but also the simulation that only includes the volcanic forcing, suggests that those forcings add power at these centennial timescales to the AMO, so they give it a longer term variability than the control simulation. Solar, at least on ensemble member 1, also shows kind of this enhancement of variability. It's the red line here. It's less discernible here. It's pretty much on the control ensemble member 2. So there are indications that these forcings, in particular the volcanic, but possibly the solar, give you this centennial variability of the AMO, kind of modulating its cycle. So then, just to finish up, what are our next steps? As I said, our simulations are still ongoing. We're about halfway through them, maybe a little bit more than that. So I have a number more to do, fill out the ensemble, both for the full and the solar and volcanic forcings. We realize when we're looking at attribution, for the full forcing, we only have 8 simulations. So we'll probably have to talk to the statistics people, and also there's another effort in CGD called the large ensemble. These are only from 1920 until 2080, but they have 30 simulations. So especially looking at attribution, for example, for some of the modes of variability, we can use that. Unfortunately, because they're shorter, we really can't look at centennial timescales. We also I just showed you kind of a preview of some of the results, lots of work to be done to look at mechanisms, to do some process-based study analysis. And actually, since they're community, we're hoping the data community actually engages on some of this. We think the single forcing simulations are important if we want to look at attribution. And that's why, although we have fewer of the full forcing, we thought those were important. I think they're also kind of important for kind of understanding either inadequacies in our parameterizations. We know, for example, that the way we're doing volcanic aerosols in the model is not the best. And also the reconstructive forcing. And a lot of work is being done on trying to get a better handle on those forcings. It's hard to do, though, going back millennium. And then finally, we really, as I promised, want to start the WACM simulation, look at high top versus low top and kind of uncertainties. And this just kind of illustrates this. I took this from, is it yours, Dan, or Mike Mills' presentation to the CESM tutorial, looking at the atmosphere going up. CAM has a top at 40 kilometers. So why WACM is up about 140, 150 kilometers. So it really will allow us to look at what some of the high top models have suggested, that both volcanic forcing of the circulation and the responses and solar may be mediated by chemistry, ozone changes that happen in the upper atmosphere. One issue we're going to have to deal with is how to handle, we include the spectral solar irradiance, spectral solar irradiance variations in the model, but right now what's been prescribed based on the CMIP experiments is based on some of the work that Judith Lean has done, Krivova have done, where as you go to maximum in solar, you expect not only the visible variations, this is delta SSI versus delta TSI in percent, to increase, but also greater increases in the UV. And at least some data suggests that it could even be opposite, or at least different magnitudes. So I think we're really going to have to decide, maybe one of our WACM experiments will not be the second Ensemble member, but it'll be exploring some of these new variations. Of course, you know more about those than I do. And why we think it is important is just shown in the study that was done a few years ago by Jerry Meal and his group. I think they used WACM 3, though I haven't figured that out yet, where they tried to understand the responses to peaks in the 11-year cycle, comparing kind of a top-down versus a bottom-up simulation. So this is changes in precipitation, annual precipitation in millimeters per day. The top left is the observed pattern. You're looking over the Pacific there, centered over the Pacific. So you see these large decreases and increases in precipitation when you compare the peak in the 11-year solar cycle versus just climatology. When they run the CCSM3, which is the low top model, so they're looking at a bottom-up response, they do see some response here. It's fairly muted, though it's significant, basically due to, they ascribe it to with increases in solar irradiance getting to the surface of the ocean during, in cloud-free regions, that leads to more evapotranspiration, circulation changes, and changes in precipitation here in the ITCZ. Then they do what they call a top-down experiment, where they use WACM, but they prescribe the ocean temperatures so that you're not getting the response they found in CCSM3. Again, they do find some response that is significant, tied to changes in the stratospheric response to ozone. And then the bottom one here is the coupled response. And now you see a much stronger response when you include both of these. So just to conclude, there's still a lot of work to do, not only with CESM, but in the community. We're making significant progress, though. There are a number of new records, especially high-resolution record, where they can really start to look at annual time scales. And working with, particularly with isotope-enabled models, they're trying to get a better interpretation of what their proxies, their stable water isotopes, carbon isotopes are telling them. There's a lot of work also being done on these reconstructions, particular, as I said, in terms of volcanic eruptions, solar activity, but also a number of land use reconstructions, which could be important. And we're now getting more sophisticated models, higher resolution models, high top models that include more effects in terms of aerosols, in terms of processes. And we're now able to run these models because we have these supercomputers like Yellowstone. Of course, I'm sure we'll add so much to the model that it'll get too slow again, but hopefully the computers will still get faster and faster. So I think it's kind of this combination working with the data, with the reconstructions, and with the models that we have that'll really take us forward and allow us to make even greater progress on trying to understand if there is a solar climate connection when we look at the last millennium. So thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, Andy. How well do these kind of highly parameterized simulations capture the contemporary evolution? I mean, do they reproduce the contemporary evolution very well from an observational standpoint?
When you're talking about contemporary, do you mean historical?
No, I'm talking about the last 30, 40, 50 years of really high resolution observation. Do the models reproduce the current state extraordinarily well?
Well, I don't know if I'd say extraordinary. That's probably in the eye of the beholder, but the models have gotten better and better. It's not that they're perfect, and I have found that, at least in the paleoclimate world, it's as much the model as what we put in it, some of the assumptions we make, and some of the unknowns that are still holding us back. So I think there's work to be done, but I think the models are getting better, especially as you go to higher and higher resolution. I'm talking kind of in the broad sense, and I've looked at, for example, the modes of variability. They are doing much, much better. Not perfect, for example, in terms of the NAO. It gets too strong of a signal in the Pacific that we don't see in observations. But the other thing we need to realize is, again, nature is one realization. So you need to run the model many, many, many times, especially if you want to get down to regional timescales.
To that, I was wondering, if you compare the new CESM simulation with the CSM1, the earliest simulation, can you say that some aspect is now better, maybe with improved physics, or is kind of the CSM simulation also forcing the natural variability or the model variability kind of from the perspective of the new simulations?
Well, I trust this simulation a bit more because, for example, ENSO variability in previous versions, first it was too small, and then it had the wrong period. It was about 2 to 3 years. So if you want to look at that variability and how it teleconnects to affecting climate, it's much better. I think, though again, I'm not completely trusting the proxy records, that hydrologic response in the model is still maybe a little bit damped. But that said, when you look at the proxy records, there's a famous map that, who made it again? I can't think of his name at the moment, where he looked at kind of MCA minus little ice age changes in hydrologic cycle, and he shows little half moons for wetter and drier, and Nick Graham. Nick Graham is a great synoptic climatologist, but I emailed him last week and I said, well, how did you define MCA and little ice age? And he said, well, kind of vaguely. We looked at each record and said, oh, Wettest, driest. Okay, another record. He said he was surprised he didn't get in trouble with the reviewers. So I think there's a lot of internal variability also. But yeah, I do. There are some aspects that I trust better. The large scale look very similar between the two.
Yeah, along the same lines, I had a similar question. So apart from all the input physics that you put in, just from the perspective of a nonlinear system, as you increase the resolution and you look at the variability among ensemble members, how does that vary with increasing the resolution? Does that go down or does that go up? For example, you can think of a low-resolution nonlinear system might exhibit more variability than a higher resolution system.
We did see that in CSM1, at least for the ocean circulation. I haven't looked at that recently. I mean, these simulations, we do need to compare them. The large ensemble, we have the same ocean in both, but different atmospheres. What I have looked at so far in these is they look quite comparable. But I've looked at things like sea ice, not variability. Things like the AMO, the NAO, all about the same. ENSO, actually, variability is a little bit stronger in the lower resolution, which maybe goes, but that may be due to not resolution, but the way some of the parameterizations go into the lower resolution. So that's a good question. They're all fairly high resolution, though.
So someone from ACD is going to ask you about the solar stuff. All the rest of the questions from HAO people a bit about the model. So how different is the, you didn't use lean, which is what we use for CMIP5 generally.
We did use, it's very similar to lean.
Okay,
Lean's 2002. It's about they're all about 0.1%, a little bit more, a little bit less, going from under minimum to present. What was really interesting in the fourth assessment report is everyone had adopted her 1995, I think, reconstruction was about 0.23 or 0.25. And then partway through writing of the IPCC, that's a 6-year process, Judith, who was actually, I think, working on the radiative forcing chapter, said, oh, never mind, it's 0.1. So there had to be some quick work by some of the models that are a little bit simpler to kind of compare the two. But it does depend on the climate sensitivity, too, which is interesting that, we can get the same response with less forcing.
So you're using CAM5, which actually takes solar spectral irradiance, right? So is there an opportunity here to look at the period from 1850 to present day, look at the 11-year cycle, and see how that differs between these two solar spectral irradiance data sets? How the model responds differently, or do you think that they're equivalent?
So you mean between, for example,
so
Kravova's versus the...
Sapphire versus
yeah.
NRL, is that the two that we're looking at? So there's twice the variability in the UV, and then half the variability in the longer wavelength.
Yeah, you know.
So there might be an opportunity here to look at the 11-year solar cycle in the low-top model between the two.
Yeah, you could, yeah. We thought of doubling the solar and for the whole run, but you're right. We could just start these at 1850 and do a whole series of them if we wanted to, just in CESM Camp 5. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I guess the flavor of my question will place me in the solar camp because I'm going to ask about the climate modeling. So when you're running something to attribute the sensitivity to an individual forcing agent like solar, what do you use as the baseline? Is it a Earth that has nothing else changing and then you change the solar, or is it everything changing and then you remove the solar from that?
Yeah, there's many ways to do that. Yeah, what we chose to do is they all start at 850, the 850 control, and we just change one of the forcings and we keep these others at 850. So in the solar forcing, you change it, but you keep the greenhouse gases. at 850 levels, which probably isn't very big, really. The orbital, the volcanoes, all at 850. Other people have done ones where they kind of add them. They start out and they put in only greenhouse gas, then add solar, then add volcanoes or some other order. So there's both ways to do it, and they both have benefits.
Yeah, it just seems if there's coupling, say El Nino putting more moisture into parts of the Pacific, that could influence the solar forcing effects that you might get in those
Well, you know,
regions.
another interesting thing, let me just go back to this, which has been a debate for IPCC, is there's usually an historical set of simulations. And what they've done at most modeling groups is they run a simulation at 1850, control, just everything held at 1850, and then they start from there. That has no memory of the system of what's happened here in terms of solar, volcanic. And in fact, we are cooler at 1850 than the 1850 control. And you can think of ocean heat content in that. So it can be an issue. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to affect, it affects the final number we're coming to for how warm the temperature was at 2005, but not the delta very much.
Another question, so how regional does the CESM get? For example, at first you showed the reconstruction for monsoons, Asian monsoons. Can the CESM kind of capture some features of that?
Yes and no. You know, some monsoons are simulated better than others, and I don't even like the term Asian monsoon, but that's what these authors used. When you think of what's happening over China, you really have kind of the East Asian monsoon coming off the Pacific, or you have the Indian monsoon. You have a number of monsoons there. The models generally, they're all over the place, is what I would say, including CESM. It does a fairly good job of the Indian monsoon, but maybe doesn't get kind of some of the tight regional. But sometimes what you need to think about in a model is, we tell the data people this, is don't try to look at the grid point right over your Chinese cave. Kind of look at that region in a bigger picture, look at the circulation patterns, the change in precipitation seasonally. So a good colleague and friend of mine grew up in Nanjing, where Hulu Cave is there. And he found at least this was a lower resolution model in CCSM3. It was off by about a grid cell or two. Didn't even have the right seasonal cycle. But if we went a little bit east, it looked just like Nanjing's observed. So yeah, hydrologic cycle is more difficult. And I'd say the Asian monsoon is a challenge for these models.
More questions? Let's think Bette again.